I definitely think we're in an inflection point, and I definitely think it's been really exciting to see kind of this collinearity between maximizing financial returns, but also having this deep impact as well.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Jenna Nicholas. Jenna is a powerhouse. We have a fascinating conversation today where we look at her role as an investor, which is very non-traditional. We look at social responsibility, whether people should care about anything but shareholder returns. We talk about her book, The Enlightened Bottom Line, exploring the intersection of spirituality, business, and investing. She's the CEO of Impact Experience, where she brings different stakeholders together to discuss these topics. I think you'll really enjoy the conversation. So Jenna Nicholas, welcome to the podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's so fun to do this with friends. You and I met years ago at Stanford. You were my student. I was lucky enough to have you in my class. And when I run into students, I always ask them the same question. Do you remember anything that I taught you in the class about negotiation?
I remember so much, and I use it honestly on a weekly basis. And it's pretty amazing to come back to some of the core principles. I'd say one of the core elements that I come back to a lot is the idea of really investing the time and understanding what is the other person looking for. So often we can assume that we know that going in and that we're kind of optimizing for the same things, but actually investing in and deep listening of what is the person looking for? And maybe there's a way to achieve more of a win-win outcome rather than only I can win or they can win. And so I often come back to that principle.
Fantastic. Well, we have a lot to cover. You've just released a book, and you were nice enough to send me an advance copy. And I just really recommend this book. The title, which tells a lot about the book, is The Enlightened Bottom Line, Exploring the Intersection of Spirituality, Business, and Investing. So tell us a little bit about the motivation to write the book and where you're going with it.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. I've been really excited to have it out in the world, and it seems to be resonating with people. I had a few inspirations. One was part of my previous work was working with the Calvert Funds. It's one of the pioneers in the area of social responsible investing. It's now $45 billion in assets under management. And I worked very closely with the founder, Wayne Silby, who actually wrote the foreword of the book. And he shared this story of this experience that he had. And I think this is really a great example of self-negotiation, which I feel like is such an important aspect of so much of this work. But in the late 1970s, when they were first starting Calvert, and it was quite a successful money market fund at the time. And he went to this Buddhist retreat, and they had them reflect on what would it say on their tombstones. And his reflection was, it would say, the man that made 2% more than the next man. And he reflected, he said, this isn't really the legacy that I want to leave. And so he went back to his team and he encouraged them to integrate social responsible investing into what they were doing. And I said, it's now $45 billion in assets under management. But it really came from this moment. And I began to reflect on that and had a series of conversations with other investors and business leaders around what was the role of transformational moments and experiences in shaping how they thought about questions of legacy and what is the impact that they're trying to have in this world. And I'm part of the Baha'i community and have been really interested for all of my life in sort of how our values shape our work and our lives. And so thought it would be interesting to interview a series of successful investors and business leaders and put together some of their insights that hopefully could be helpful to other people who are thinking about some of these questions around meaning and purpose in their lives.
No, I just love that. And you and I have talked about our respective religions. You're a member of the Baha'i community of friends. I'm a member of the Mormon church. And it's certainly been the driver for me in terms of my values and how I've approached business. I'd love you to go just briefly through your primary framework of the book. And before you do that, maybe a couple of the case stories. I'm remembering the story you told about Patagonia, which resonated. I'm a client, I guess, a user of Patagonia clothing.
Patagonia, as many of you may know, has been really a pioneer in the areas of integrating social impact into the fabric of their business. And I think really great case study of how to build a really successful business and also be deeply concerned about the impact on the communities that they're operating in and the impact on the environment. And what's really exciting about the way that they've structured what they've done is a number of years ago now, the CEO decided to create a structure that, how he describes it, is that where nature will own the company moving forward. And basically what that is, and it's an entity called the Holdfast Collective, but they have basically transferred majority of the assets of the company into a foundation structure that enables the ability to perpetuate the social impact over time. And it's what's been really amazing about it is not only the impact for Patagonia itself, but also that it's inspiring others to set up similar types of entities, perpetual trust. So we've worked with a number of companies who are looking at setting up similar structures to be able to preserve their social impact and environmental impact over time. So really a pioneer in that work. The other example around Panera, a dear friend, Niran Chowdhury, who was the CEO of Panera for a number of years, and during COVID was really struggling to work out how were they going to keep any of their operations working. And at the same time, and particularly looking at Ohio, but this is of course a challenge across the country, where many of the schools were closing down and many children in the communities were reliant upon getting their school lunches every day. And this question of how are they going to continue to be fed? And Niran, I think, again, is a really good example around negotiation and a win-win outcome of, he had this idea and actually contacted the Ohio governor of, could Panera be able to provide healthy, affordable lunches for the schools that was paid for, by the USDA, and so created this whole structure to be able to keep some Panera stores open, provide healthy food for the schools, for the school children, and actually so much so that he was invited to the White House to share about the experience, and I sort of share a little bit about what that experience was like for him. So I think with both of these examples of both very successful companies, but where they've been really thoughtful, and it's so much of it has come from leadership that really cared about not just the maximization of financial returns, but also this deep consideration around social and environmental impact. And that it was really conversations like these that led to the development of the framework for the book, which is the HEAL framework, which stands for hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy. And you can probably see even just in those two stories that I shared some of these principles embedded in terms of how are we actively cultivating hope, and particularly given so many of the challenges that exist in the world right now. We talked earlier around the importance of empathy, as particularly in negotiation, and then abundance as a way of thinking about the circulation of capital in the world rather than a hoarding of capital, and then legacy, and of coming back to this question of, what do we want it to say on our tombstones?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm thinking two thoughts. The first one is, I'd love your take on where we are as economic community in this country on these issues. You and I have talked about some of the early nonprofits that focused on this, business for social responsibility. And I used to go to those conferences, and you had these, companies like Ben & Jerry's and Patagonia. But now, it's my perspective, I'd love your take, that this is becoming more mainstream. I mean, when a company like BlackRock, Larry Fink, the CEO, has really been one of the most prominent advocates of ESG, and you can tell listeners a little bit about what that is. And he's done it in an interesting way that I think really helps, which is not to promote this as do-gooderism, but as risk management. And if you think about, all the stakeholders involved in a company, whether it's employees or suppliers or customers or governments or regulators, it's way beyond just the shareholders. So do you agree with me that we're at a little bit of an inflection point, and things are changing since you and I started getting interested in this work years ago?
100%. I definitely think we're in an inflection point, and I definitely think it's been really exciting to see the increase in interest and engagement around ESG. It stands for environmental social governance. We're seeing this with the trillions of dollars that's taking place in intergenerational wealth transfer, where a lot of interest from the next generation in investing in a way that is more aligned with values. Seeing many institutional investors, I've served on the advisory committee for Apollo launched, and impact fund, and this is a $500 billion firm that, where impact hasn't necessarily been part of the DNA, but so many of these institutional investors, a big part of it coming from client demand, are setting up these impact funds to really respond to that interest. And with many of these structures, it's very much looking at this collinearity between financial returns and social and environmental impact. And I think about one company that I share about in the book and had a chance to invest in is a company called Isuzu, and they just raised at a $1.2 billion valuation. They have a deep social impact in their core, where they are and really coming from the personal experiences of the co-founders, but they are using rental data as part of the consideration of building out one's credit score, which provides a huge opportunity for home ownership that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So I think about interventions like that, and like young people that are wanting to both work in financial institutions to invest in a way that's more socially and environmentally responsible, but also wanting to build companies that are not just focused on maximizing financial returns, but also having this deep impact as well.
That's excellent. I'm thinking of the parallel between in negotiation, often people measure success by winning, beating the other side, getting the most. And often investors measure success by, return on investment. And they have all kinds of, ratios, as that they look at to basically measure, returns to shareholders. So how does the HEAL framework, I love it that you outline that. And in the book, it's really persuasive how you put that forward. But give us some examples of how the HEAL framework would help persuade someone that they shouldn't just focus on a traditional bottom line. We've got the language of the double bottom line that started about 20 years ago, and you're taking it even further. So can you give us some examples of how the HEAL framework has shifted the way people measure success in negotiation?
I love that question. And I actually think like the example I was just starting to share there with Isuzu, they have very much found, and I found in working with them really from the beginning, that part of in their conversations with investors and conversations that had with them early on, that actually having frameworks like being able to connect deeply around some of these themes of hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy, to ensure that there's alignment early on between what are we actually trying to do here? Because I think we see so often companies that may start off on a certain trajectory and may be concerned around social and environmental impact that may, partly if they don't have aligned investors, may end up not having that successful negotiation, and there being more of a disconnect there. And I think the HEAL framework provides an opportunity to achieve and come back to ongoing alignment over time. And think about another example that I talk about in the book. It's a company called Devoted Health. They're now valued at over $13 billion. And they credit a lot of their financial success to an exercise that they have all of their employees do. So they're a healthcare organization, they're patient-facing. And before they have any engagement with any patient, they are encouraged to close their eyes and imagine that the patient that they're about to interact with is a member of their family. And their net promoter score, the growth of their company, has been incredible in comparison to many of their peers. And they credit it to this simple act, right? It's literally just closing your eyes and imagining that this person is part of your family. And I think that exercise is embodies so much of the HEAL framework, right? It's this deep empathy of how differently would you engage if you're coming from that perspective, rather than coming back to negotiation, rather than just seeing this as more of a transaction. It's a deep relationship.
I love that. I'm going to use it. So my next annual checkup with my primary care doctor, I'm going to start off our 15-minute engagement by saying, can you please close your eyes? Yeah. Imagine that I'm a member of your family, and just pause for a minute. And I think the next 14 minutes will go better. I love that because, we could go on a tangent on healthcare, but empathy is certainly less high on the priority list of doctors that in terms of my experience. And so I think that's really beautiful. Now, let me play the skeptic for a second. A lot of people will be saying, okay, so you might have a leader that buys into this. and it might buy into the HEAL framework, and he or she might buy into ESG and multi-stakeholder analysis and all these terms that we're using. But maybe I've got an investor who's a prominent board member who's just saying, yes, Dan, or yeah, Jenna, that sounds moralistic, and don't push your morals on me. So your job is to then negotiate with that board member and try to convince him or her that no, this isn't sort of self-righteous morality. This is actually good for the stakeholders. Can you kind of play that out for me?
100%. And that's, part of the reason that some of these examples I'm choosing, actually all of the ones that we've talked about, so far, right? Devoted Health, Isuzu, Panera, Patagonia, right? That they all, even if we were to just strip out all of the social and environmental impact that they have, they've all been incredibly strong performing companies financially, right? And I think that, and we've come up to this theme a lot around language, and I think this is also a really important aspect around negotiation, right? It's like, what is the language that you're using that understands the context in which somebody is coming from? And I found this a lot over the years, when I was building this coalition of foundations to shift capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions. A lot of the times when we were talking to these investors, that they had this fiduciary responsibility to maximize financial returns, was being able to have the conversation using the language that they are focused on and what they're optimizing for. And like, it's great that we can have all this social and environmental impact, but let's also make sure that we can make the case financially, and because I think that's a huge part of the negotiating with people that may be more skeptical and may have less exposure to models where there is an ability to achieve both financial returns and that social and environmental impact. So I think meeting people where they are and being able to really understand what is it that they're maximizing for, and how to ensure that it's meeting their goals along the way.
Now, a lot of these people, let's take this same investor that's got his or her skeptical hat on, and they're going to say, yeah, but I want to see that long term, if I apply the HEAL framework, if I care about multiple stakeholders, I'm going to increase shareholder value, that those things coincide. It's not just do-gooderism. And in your book, you make a claim, and I just thought this was bold and great, and I want to see the backup for it, that if trust erodes in organizations, long-term shareholder value decreases. Is that anecdotal? Do you have research on that? How would you persuade me, the skeptical investor?
Yes, I mean there is a number of pieces of research that I drew on around it. There's a book that's really good called Deep Purpose, and I reference it and they have they've done some research and analysis that kind of identifies companies, and the framing that they had for it was companies that invest in purpose. So I think that there's a lot around when they break down sort of the factors that lead into purpose, trust as being a really core aspect of that. I think one of the key aspects of this is around employee retention, right? Is that in addition to just the generation of the strong financial returns, there's also the challenges that come from churn. And that's what came up in a lot of the interviews that I did for the book. One example of a company that has really invested deeply in trust is Barry-Wehmiller, and they went from, I think it was like $8 million in revenue to $14 billion in revenue in like a 10-year time horizon, and really credit a lot of that financial growth to being deeply invested in building trust with all of their employees. They have 14,000 employees around the world, and I had a chance to interview the chairman there, Bob Chapman, for the book. And I think a big part of it was being able to see some of these examples, and they talked a lot about the trust that they were able to generate with both their employees and their partners as a mechanism for generating that over time. So I think that between some of the research that's been done, as well as some of these case studies of companies that have really put that as one of their core values and exemplify that in how they go about their practices, it's been really powerful to witness.
That's amazing. Just another reason to read the book, because people need to see this research. People need to see the data. I think the skeptics are going to be proven wrong after reading your book. Let's dive in for just a second on the spiritual element. The subtitle of your book is Exploring the Intersection of Spirituality, Business, and Investing. Now, some people, the majority of Americans don't have a currently a spiritual base and probably an active religious life. How do you persuade them? I think that what are examples of where spirituality helps business?
Yeah, so I think what's been really interesting in so many of the conversations that I had with people for this book is when I'd ask them around what role spirituality had played for them, I'd hear this line, and I talk about this in the book, where they would say, I don't really feel like I can talk about it, but, and then they would share these incredible experiences, sometimes challenging experiences, but that had really shaped who they are and why they do what they do. And I think that this piece around like, how do we lower the barriers to entry for people to have some of these conversations around spirituality, and thinking to this point about language, that coming back to the core of what does spirituality actually mean? And spirituality comes from the Latin word spiritus, which means breath, and like literally this idea of breathing new life into our businesses and our organizations. And that was really a big part of why I chose to have this focus around spirituality, is that particularly given so many of the challenges that are going on in the world right now, being able to reframe why we're doing what we're doing and to be able to contribute towards something productive and feel as though we're actually building a new world rather than just watching so much of the world that we're in crumble, I think is a big part of the role that businesses can play in society, and a big part of the inspiration that can come from a spiritual orientation that can ground in that.
I remember a negotiation I had. This is only slightly related, but it came to mind as you were talking. I was right out of undergrad. I was working at Wall Street in an investment bank, and long hours. And as a member of the Mormon Church, you often have an active role in the church, what we call a calling. And I was the leader of the Boy Scout troop. And to be the leader of the Boy Scout troop, I had to go on some hikes and backpacking trips on the weekends. And I had a regular Tuesday meeting. So I went to my managing director and I said, look, I know typically people are working 90, 100 hours a week in these jobs. I want to be your best performer. I want to be measured on my output, but I have these commitments to these boys because of my church. And I didn't know how that was going to go. But he said, look, I really think this is important. I'm going to defend you on this. So he basically defended me. So when Friday afternoon came around and work was being handed out to all the analysts, he'd say, oh no, Stan, he's out there working for God. So everyone else, you need to come in on the weekends. He's going to be with the Boy Scouts. And I ended up getting out of a tremendous amount of work. And he wasn't a spiritual man by himself in his own life, but he saw that was valuable to me and ended up, helping me to be able to kind of live a more balanced investment bank analyst life. Now, I think that, your reaction, one of the things about what you said that I found interesting is people really, when you ask them about their spirituality or share yours, in my experience, similar to yours, people tend to be open to it and have maybe more spirituality than they might be wearing on their sleeve, so to speak. And so what can organizations do? Because the first reaction is, oh no, we're talking about spirituality. We shouldn't be talking about that here. But what would your advice be to an organization who wants to embed some spiritual principles structurally, as opposed to have it be based on the morality of the CEO, and she might be a member, let's say you're the CEO, you're a member of the Friends of Baha'i, but that's very individual. So can you embed those spiritual principles using your framework in an organization and not have it just be individual based?
100%. And that was a big part of what exploring the book. And, another example that shown in the book where they've really been intentional about this is a hotel chain called Innisfree Hotels. And they've actually developed a cultural manifesto that is very much a series of spiritual principles embedded within their organizational framework. And they have thousands of employees, and they all go through culture training as part of their onboarding. They have a culture leader that kind of comes back to a lot of these principles. And a lot of these are, they have one that's like no power plays or getting rid of paranoid fantasies and the importance of check-ins. And they have 12 principles that are structurally embedded into performance reviews, into decision-making frameworks. And it kind of came from a series of spiritual principles, but they really went through a process of what is the rigorous way that we can embed this into the fabric of the the organization and of coming back to this point around trust and employee retention, that they've really found that it's not only led into the financial success of the company, but also been something that people are inspired to want to work there because they know that this is something that's deeply invested in. And it's not that anyone needs to be any part of any particular religion, but rather a series of spiritual principles that people can come back to as a framework for decision making.
I want to talk about impact experience. So about 10 years ago, you started this nonprofit, and you and I have had a chance to talk about that. You've come to my class and guest lectured and just been really effective in that mode. But what is impact experience and why did you start it?
So a big part of the inspiration for us in starting Impact Experience was my previous work. I had helped to build a coalition of 170 foundations representing about $50 billion in assets under management that was shifting capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions. And I went to visit New Orleans to a place that's known as Cancer Alley. And I met with this group called the Bucket Brigade. And they do incredible work in the community, really documenting a lot of the challenges from the oil spill-offs there. And I started to talk to them and understand what they were working on and their priorities. And I was sharing a bit about some of this work that we were doing in building this coalition of foundations. And I realized just how disconnected so many of the funders and companies that we were working with were from communities like that in Cancer Alley. And what would it look like to really create these spaces to build bridges, and really coming back to this theme of negotiation, that the core ability to building off what we were just talking about of really understanding where each person is coming from. If you're in the room together and you're a funder or you're a person working on the front lines in a community, how much more effective would that be? And so our work at Impact Experience is really focused on bringing together groups of entrepreneurs, funders, artists in communities that have been overlooked and underestimated, really with the goal of unlocking capital and partnerships in those communities.
Sounds interesting. You've invited me to come to various seminars, and I haven't been able to make it. I'm trying to get a sense. So I'm in the room, I'm with these 25 people. Is the objective then for me as an investor to want to invest more dollars in that community because I understand that person? Because my constituents, as you know, are limited partners and they just want an investment return. They're not looking for empathy. So talk about that, the kind of stakeholder analysis and how you approach that, what the goals are.
Yeah, so our work is really focused on looking at addressing equity across investments, climate, healthcare, and education. And when we think about success, certainly a big part of it is unlocking capital and broader partnerships in the communities, but it's also influencing how investors think about their asset allocation more broadly. So I mentioned briefly just a moment ago, when we look at the asset management industry and the $82 trillion and less than 2% being invested into women and people of color run companies and funds, that is the idea then is actually research from Stanford that demonstrates that investors are actually leaving money on the table because of the role that biases are playing in their investment decision-making process. So even if you are just optimizing for financial returns and that there isn't a consideration of social and environmental impact, being intentional about having a diversified portfolio that we're all taught to focus on as being a really important aspect of that. So we define success both in terms of what's actually happening within the communities, but also what the firms then go on to do with their broader decision-making processes as well.
Interesting. So you mentioned that you have themes, healthcare, education. Can you give us some examples or stories of when you've had successes in those verticals? Do investments actually get made?
Yeah. So when in the West Virginia example that we talked a bit about, one of our key partners in the community, incredible Dr. Dino Beckett, runs a federally qualified healthcare clinic, and it's a community that has incredibly high rates of diabetes, obesity, many laid off coal miners. And the work there has really been at the confluence of both healthcare and climate. And much of the work there has been unlocking capital to actually purchase a local hotel in the community to build out the tourism asset. So it's an incredibly beautiful place, but people don't necessarily think about it as a tourist destination. So being able to, as part of that retraining work of former coal miners, building out the economic opportunities in the community as well as they have an amazing innovation at the local health center around addressing type 2 diabetes. And so we've unlocked capital to invest into some of the technologies that they've been building out to work with people in the community around that. So it's been these really interesting examples of both, your earlier point around generating financial returns, of both generating strong financial returns, but also having this incredible social and environmental impact in the community.
That's amazing. One of the key issues, and you and I have talked for years about this space, and so much of it is just understanding each other. And, I might, if I was, an investor that had grown up with the text of Milton Friedman, I think, the quote from Milton Friedman is, "The social responsibility of business is to increase profits, period." And back when I went to business school, I was certainly taught that, equity is what's important. As long as you return, capital to shareholders, the social responsibility will come out of that. You're taking a very different approach. Let's talk about healthcare for a minute. So the pharmaceutical companies obviously are under a lot of pressure. People feel like they're not being fair and just reaping profits. Have you had any experience where maybe a pharmaceutical executive came to one of your programs and there were communication, trust building things that changed for one of the parties?
100%. So particularly during COVID, we hosted a series of experiences focused around health equity and in collaboration with our partners in Montgomery, Alabama. And we had, taking part in our experiences, a number of people from pharmaceutical companies, including companies that were developing COVID vaccines, and were really struggling to understand why they were having such backlash in certain communities. And what was fascinating is that many of these people were working in offices in New York and San Francisco and hadn't actually spent time with people in communities who were the customers that they were seeking to sell and these drugs and vaccines to. And so we had people in the community share about the history of the lack of trust that they had in the healthcare system. And it really, you could see this sort of light bulb go off for many of the people from the pharmaceutical companies in being able to understand, we really need to go through trusted local institutions. And coming back to, again, this theme of the negotiation of who are the people involved in the conversation who are trusted partners within a community who can be the intermediaries for delivering some of these messages that, having a large pharmaceutical company make a big announcement and assume that people on the front lines of communities are going to listen to that was a misconceived notion. But working with local faith-based institutions and musicians and people who were deeply respected within the community really shifted in terms of how people thought about what they could trust and what they couldn't.
I love that. One thing I frequently say in negotiation is that it's very difficult not to like people you spend time with. And I think that's true in the work that you're doing. I think it's true internationally. If we just kind of go back to your example of, investors, which tend to be very, coastal oriented, New York, San Francisco, it's very hard for them to understand the plight of, let's stick with the West Virginia coal miner, unless they spend time on the ground. So what you're doing that's so powerful is giving them a chance to spend 3 days in workshop format and have empathy. It's natural. The stories are going to come out. Now, I've been involved in some of that work over the years. And one of the if I put my skeptical hat on, I might say, okay, as an investor, I went and had a great 3 days. But then I go back to my office and, I've got pressures and I've got deals and I've got limited partners. What do you do to measure the effectiveness of those 3 days and translating into results? I could imagine dollars invested might be one metric, but how do you follow up and continue that 3-day, quote, trust building exercise so that there is ongoing empathy back and forth? Does that work?
Totally. And it's such a huge aspect of the work to ensure that it really is an ongoing engagement rather than just this is great and go back to our day-to-day work, exactly as you say. So a couple of elements on that. One is the framework that we use around commitment setting, that very much comes from negotiation, is the SMARTY framework. So specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, timely, inclusive, and equitable. So we have everybody while we're actually still in the room, so they're still inspired and excited by the time that they've been spending together, have them reflect first individually on what they're inspired to commit to, and then share out with the group. So the role of group accountability as part of really distilling those commitments within their own selves. And then we have follow-up calls afterwards with each of the participants and follow-up surveys to really follow on from those commitments that they've made to ensure that there is that fulfillment over time. We continue to support and connect the dots around that. So exactly as you say, a lot of what we're looking at is unlocking capital, but also broader partnerships that have formed. And what's been really amazing to see, we now have about 5,000 people that have gone through the experiences in 15 different communities. And many of those people have come to multiple experiences. They've continued to collaborate with people even across different experiences. So we very much talk about this as like you're joining a community rather than just coming to an event.
Fantastic. The one vertical that you've mentioned that we haven't talked about as much as education, and I think there's a lot of miscommunication around education. There's a lot of equity. There's a lot of access issues. Any stories about, in workshop format, how you had breakthroughs in the educational vertical?
Yeah, so we did some work with Arizona State University, and also the theme of negotiation comes up all the time in all of our work. This was, we had in the group, so the Arizona State University is on land, much of which is indigenous owned, and also there's a very strong Latinx community there too. And so there's been ongoing conversations in, as they develop their real estate assets, how to be in community with the local indigenous and Latinx communities. And so we brought together a group of local and national real estate developers, people from the indigenous and Latinx communities, people from ASU, to really look at, in the development of the educational institution, how to be in strong and close community with the local populations. And it actually led to about a $16 million investment into some local affordable housing opportunities that was really helpful in terms of for students that were graduating from the university, for staff that was working there. And so similarly to this broader theme that keeps coming up around and really investing in that trust, that through investing in these trusted relationships between an educational institution and the community can both lead to investments being made, but also ongoing friendships over time as well.
Fantastic. What a great outcome. You know, one of the things that this kind of work where you put people in a room together, I often find that, you know, people end up questioning some of the assumptions that they may have had coming into the meeting. Do you have any examples of a participant who came in with certain assumptions, and because he or she spent time with the other group, it just rocked his or her world?
Many. I think about, one person who had grown up in a community that was predominantly a white community and had a very successful career, had been an investor. And I remember about halfway through the first day, like he was sort of come aside and he was clearly quite emotional. And he's like, I had one of the best educations I could possibly have had, but I had no idea about like the real history of our country. And it was really amazing because you could feel this shift from this very sort of confident bravado to this like deep kind of humility of really wanting to learn and engage. And we always have norms in all of our experiences that we start with, and we have this norm that's like step up and step back, and to really encouraging people that typically wouldn't talk so much to talk more, and people who maybe talk a lot to talk less. And I was thinking early on, I was like, oh, this is probably someone we might need to coach through talking a little less. But the experience had that impact on him, where he just was so humbled and really was there from this perspective of learning. And he went on to do incredible things with his investment portfolio and really increase the allocations that he was making into women and people of color run companies and funds as a result. But it really came from, I think, really spending time with other people in the group and hearing their stories and just learning more about the history.
Wow. Well, congratulations on that work. I mean, you mentioned that 5,000 people. I mean, that's a lot of workshops if you're doing, 25 people at a time. You've worked in in 15 different communities. And I think the work you've done has been amazing. Our environment today, I think there's less trust every day. It's hard to turn on the news or look at social media and not see a lack of trust. And so, you and I on this podcast might say, look, read Jenna's book. That's going to help you come up with strategies to decrease trust. That'd be one good idea. Another might be attend Jenna's workshops. She's doing these all over the country in these communities, and you can really learn a lot from doing that. But let's assume that people either do those things or don't have time, and you get the chance now to recommend to them. What are 2 or 3 spiritual principles that, assuming they may not participate in an organized religion, that they can take into the workplace that will increase not only their happiness, but the outcomes for the different stakeholders? So if you could think of kind of 2 or 3 spiritual principles, what would your advice be if I'm coming to you wanting that?
I love that question. Thank you. One thought that comes to my mind is there's a quotation from the Baha'i writings that says, "Let your heart burn with loving kindness for all who may cross your path." And I think that's something, it's so simple, right? But that when we think about as we're engaging with our colleagues and work environment, or as we're engaging with strangers, that really thinking about what does it look like to love this person? And I think so much of that comes from deep listening. Like, how are we creating the space to truly listen to somebody, and not with the idea, and then coming back to negotiation, not with the idea of trying to convince them of our point of view, but to really hear what they have to say and what they have to share. And that particularly, seeking out people that may share different worldviews from ourselves, and asking and understanding what is their story and what is their context, and that it's something that we can all do no matter, where we are, and understanding people's humanity and connecting from that place of humanity as being a core idea.
I'd love to drill down we're almost out of time, but I'd love to drill down on that a little bit, because listening, I think we all would agree that we could improve upon listening. The deep listening would make the world a better place. But do you have any stories, either from a workshop or from your book, where someone actually implemented deep listening and it ended up being persuasive from a negotiation perspective?
Yes, actually, there's someone, an investor that a dear friend, who actually a big part of their spiritual practice is around appreciative inquiry, and they will often, and it's kind of amazing interacting with them, because there's, so often, I think even without realizing it, when someone's sharing, and particularly if they're sharing something that we may not agree with, we're thinking about, as they're talking, we're thinking, oh, what am I going to say that's going to convince them of something different? And how am I going to respond to this? And the way that she approaches her listening is that it's truly, I am just present to what you are sharing in this moment. And what's been really amazing in seeing with her work is that providing that space for this deep listening has led to huge amounts of capital being shifted around from people that a lot of her focus is around racial equity and investing, and people that have come in pretty skeptical about why that's important. But because, not that she's spending all her time convincing them that it's important, but because they have a space to actually just talk through what's really going on for them, they leave, and I've seen it happen many times, where they leave these interactions and they are like, oh yeah, maybe I can do that investments. And they talk themselves into it, right? I think that's a big part also of a skill with negotiation, is the ability for people to come to the conclusions themselves, rather than just being convinced by somebody else that this is what's important, and the power of the ownership over that decision. So I've seen that mastery at work a number of times, and it's always powerful to witness.
I remember someone saying negotiation is the art of letting them have your way. I think that if you implement this principle of listening, and we'll just end with this, it's not just a nice to have or a touchy-feely or empathetic thing. It's actually a persuasive part of being a great negotiator. And I get asked that question a lot. What do you have to do to be a great negotiator? And if I say, be a deep listener, Jenna and I think so, people go, listening, of course. But I just couldn't agree with you more, that if you can be empathetic and profound, as the example that you so articulately shared with us, I think that makes you persuasive. That and so many other ideas are in your book, Enlightened Bottom Line, Exploring the Intersection of Spirituality, Business, and Investing. I was one of the lucky few to read it before it came out. It is just out, and just hope that people run off and, assuming they enjoyed this conversation, get more of you through that book.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the opportunity here, and thank you for all the seeds of wisdom from your class many years ago as well.
Oh, it's so great to have you. Thanks, Jenna. Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.